The morning light came pale through the curtain, and Ara woke to the sound of bread trucks rumbling on the street below. She lay still, counting her breaths the way she'd learned to do when the world felt too close. The scent of yeast and sugar drifted up through the floorboards. Familiar and safe. This little studio above the bakery had been hers for 18 months now, and every morning she told herself it was enough. She pushed the blanket aside and sat up, bare feet finding the cool wood floor. The apartment was small. One room for everything, a hot plate, a narrow bed, a single window that looked out over the town square. She'd chosen it because no one asked questions here, and because the bakery owner needed someone who'd work early and keep to themselves. If stories like this one call to you, please subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. Ara crossed to the counter, where a small bundle of dried herbs sat in a clay dish. She lifted it, crumbled a leaf between her fingers, and felt her stomach drop. The scent was faint, nearly gone. She'd been rationing the last of it for 2 weeks, telling herself she'd find more before it mattered. But the truth was simpler and harder than that. There was no more to find. Not here. Not in a human town 3 states away from the forests, where the herbs grew wild. She closed her eyes and let the leaf fall. Without the herbs, her scent would begin to return, and with it, the bond she had spent 3 years trying to bury. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. She'd thought that distance and time would dull the pull, that eventually the tie between them would fade into something she could live beside. But every morning she woke with the same ache beneath her ribs, and every night she dreamed of amber eyes and a voice that had once promised her forever. Ara opened the window to let in the spring air, hoping it would clear her head. The square below was beginning to stir. A few early shoppers, the flower seller setting up her cart. Ara watched them and felt the loneliness settle around her shoulders like an old coat. She had left the night of the bonding ceremony, the night the pack had gathered under the full moon to witness the vows. She'd worn a dress borrowed from Taryn's aunt, simple and white, and Veyron had stood beside her with his hands steady against her back. She'd felt the bond lock into place when he spoke her name, a warmth that spread from her chest to her fingertips. But before the celebration ended, she'd slipped away to find water and overheard 2 of his advisors speaking in the corridor outside the hall. Their voices had been low but certain. A human-born mate would weaken his claim. The other packs would see it as proof he'd gone soft. If he wanted to hold the throne, he'd need someone stronger, someone born to the blood. Ara had stood very still, her hand pressed to the cool stone wall, and understood that loving him was not the same as being good for him. So she'd run. She hadn't. Said goodbye to Taryn, the boy who'd looked at her with cautious hope, and asked if she'd really stay this time. She hadn't left a letter. She'd simply walked into the forest and kept walking until the bond stretched thin and distant, a thread she could almost pretend wasn't there. The trucks outside rumbled away and the square grew quiet again. Ara turned from the window and reached for the pitcher of water on the counter. Her hand trembled. She could feel it now, the edges of the bond beginning to sharpen. Without the herbs, there would be no hiding. If he was still looking, if he hadn't given up and chosen someone else the way his advisors had wanted, he would find her. She poured the water into a bowl and splashed her face, trying to wake herself up, trying to convince herself she could run again if she had to. But she was tired of new towns and rented rooms, tired of working jobs that didn't need her name, tired of pretending the bond was something she could outlast. A shadow crossed the window. Ara looked up sharply, water still dripping from her chin. The shadow moved again, larger this time, and she heard the sound of boots on cobblestone. Slow and deliberate. She set the bowl down carefully and stepped toward the window, her heart beginning to pound. The square was empty except for the flower seller, who had paused in her work and was staring toward the far corner with her hand raised to shade her eyes. Ara's breath caught. A man stood at the edge of the square, tall and still, his coat dark against the morning light. She couldn't see his face from this angle, but she didn't need to. She knew the shape of him, the way he held himself, weight balanced and ready, the way the air around him seemed to shift when he moved. Her name came up from the street, low and certain, and she felt it in her chest like a drum. Ara! She gripped the windowsill. For 3 years she'd imagined this moment, and every time she'd told herself she would be ready, that she'd know what to say. But now her throat was tight, and her hands were shaking, and all she could do was stand there while the bond roared back to life inside her, fierce and undeniable. Veyron stepped into the center of the square and tilted his head back, his gaze finding her window. His eyes were amber and unblinking, and even from this distance she could see the tension in his jaw. He didn't look like a man who had come to let her go. He looked like a man who had tracked her across 2 states and had no intention of leaving without her. Ara, he said again, louder this time, and the flower seller took a step back, her cart forgotten. I know you're there. Ara's pulse hammered in her ears. She should close the curtain, lock the door, pretend she hadn't heard. But her body wasn't listening to her anymore. The bond was pulling her forward, and she couldn't remember why she'd ever thought she could fight it. She watched as Veyron crossed the square toward her building, his strides long and purposeful. He didn't look away from her window, didn't hesitate, and she knew, with a certainty that made her chest ache, that everything she'd run from was about to find her. She heard his footsteps on the stairs. The knock was softer than she expected. 3 measured taps, and then silence. Ara stood in the center of the room, her hand pressed to her sternum, where the bond pulled tight. She could feel him on the other side of the door, the warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his presence filled the narrow stairwell like a storm gathering strength. She didn't move. Another knock, firmer this time. Ara! His voice was low and even, but she heard the edge beneath it. Open the door! Her feet carried her forward before she'd made the decision. Her hand found the lock and turned it. The latch clicked, loud in the quiet, and she pulled the door open just wide enough to see him. Veyron stood on the landing, one hand braced against the doorframe. He was taller than she remembered, broader through the shoulders. His dark hair was longer now, tied back at the nape of his neck, and there were new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 3 years ago. He wore travel clothes, dusty and worn, and his boots were scuffed from long miles. But his eyes were the same, amber and sharp and fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You found me, she said quietly. Did you think I wouldn't? She didn't answer. Couldn't. The bond was singing now, a bright thread pulled taut between them, and it took everything she had not to step forward into his arms. Veyron's jaw tightened. He pushed away from the doorframe and moved past her into the room, his gaze sweeping over the narrow bed, the hot plate, the single window. When he turned back to her, his expression was unreadable. This is where you've been. It wasn't a question. Yes. For 3 years. Yes. He nodded slowly, his hands curling into fists at his sides. And you didn't think I deserved to know you were alive. Ara closed the door and leaned back against it, her legs suddenly unsteady. I thought it would be easier if I disappeared. Easier for who? For you. The words came out sharper than she meant them to. For the pack. For Terran. Veyron's eyes flashed, and for a moment she saw the wolf beneath the man. The alpha, who had led his people through war and loss, and still stood unbroken. But when he spoke, his voice was quiet. Dangerously quiet. You left the night we were bonded. I know. You heard the vows. You felt the bond lock into place. He took a step toward her. And then you walked away without a word. Ara's throat tightened. I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice. Another step. You made yours. Now tell me why. She looked down at her hands, trying to find the words, trying to remember the certainty she'd felt that night when she'd slipped into the forest and told herself she was doing the right thing. I overheard your advisors, she said finally. After the ceremony, they were talking in the corridor outside the hall. Veyron went still. They said a human-born mate would weaken your claim to the throne. She forced herself to meet his eyes. They said the other packs would see it as proof you'd gone soft. That if you wanted to hold your position, you'd need someone stronger. Someone born to the blood. The silence that followed was suffocating. Veyron's expression didn't change, but she saw the muscle in his jaw twitch, saw the way his hands opened and closed, like he was forcing himself to stay calm. And you believed them, he said softly. I believed they were right. Ara's voice broke. I didn't want to be the reason you lost everything you'd worked for. I didn't want Terran to grow up ashamed of the woman his father had chosen. So I left. I thought if I disappeared, you could find someone better. Someone the pack would accept. Veyron closed the distance between them in 2 strides. He didn't touch her, but he was close enough that she could feel the heat of him, the barely controlled anger radiating from his skin. You thought you were protecting me. Yes. By running. Yes. He let out a breath, low and ragged. Do you have any idea what you did? Ara looked up at him, her heart pounding. Terran thought it was his fault. Veyron said, his voice rough. He thought you left because he wasn't enough. Because you didn't want to be his mother. The words hit her like a blow. No, that's not. He stopped talking for 6 months. Veyron's eyes were bright with something that looked like pain. He stopped eating, stopped shifting. I had to watch my son break himself apart because the woman he loved walked away without saying goodbye. Ara's knees buckled, and she sank down onto the edge of the bed, her hands covering her face. I didn't know. I thought he'd be okay. I thought you'd both be okay. We weren't. Veyron crouched in front of her, his hands gripping the mattress on either side of her knees. The pack fractured. Half of them wanted to search for you. The other half said you'd made your choice and we should let you go. My rivals used it to question my judgment, said I couldn't even keep my own mate from running. Ara looked at him through her fingers, her vision blurred with tears. I stopped governing well, Veyron said quietly. I stopped caring about the politics and the alliances and all the things I was supposed to care about. Because losing you broke something I didn't know could break. I'm sorry. The words were barely a whisper. I thought I was doing the right thing. The right thing would have been to trust me. He reached up and pulled her hands away from her face, his grip firm but gentle. The right thing would have been to let me decide what I was willing to fight for. She met his eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, she let herself feel the full weight of what she'd lost. The life she'd walked away from, the family she'd left behind. I was afraid, she said. Of what? Of not being enough, her voice cracked. Of watching you realize your advisors were right. Of seeing you look at me one day and wish you'd chosen someone else. Veyron's expression softened. He lifted one hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away the tear that slid down her skin. You were always enough, he said. From the first moment I saw you, you were always more than enough. Ara closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. The bond hummed between them, warm and steady. And for the first time in 3 years, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't ruined everything. I need you to come back, Veyron said. She opened her eyes. What? Come back with me. His hand slid to the back of her neck, his forehead resting against hers. Face the pack. Face Terran. Let me show you what you walking away really cost. Ara's breath hitched. I don't know if I can. You can." His voice was certain. "You're stronger than you think you are, and I'm not letting you run again." She searched his face, looking for doubt, but all she saw was determination. The same fierce loyalty that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. "There's someone waiting for you," Veyron said quietly. "Someone who needs to see that you're real. That you didn't leave because of him." Ara's heart clenched. "Taryn. He's at the meeting house, 2 miles north of here." Veyron straightened, pulling her to her feet. "And he's not going to wait much longer." Ara sat beside Veyron in the truck, her hands folded tight in her lap. The road stretched out ahead of them, narrow and winding through trees that grew thicker the farther they drove from town. She watched the light shift through the leaves and tried to steady her breathing. 2 miles had never felt so long. Veyron drove in silence, his jaw set, one hand resting on the wheel. She could feel the tension in him, the weight of everything he wasn't saying. The bond pulled between them with every passing mile, growing stronger as the distance from her hiding place increased. She wanted to ask him what Taryn looked like now, whether he'd grown, whether he still collected smooth river stones the way he used to. But the words stuck in her throat, and she turned her face toward the window instead. The meeting house appeared through a break in the trees. It was small and weathered, built from stone and timber, with moss growing thick along the foundation. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and pale against the afternoon sky. Veyron pulled the truck to a stop in the gravel clearing and cut the engine. The silence that followed felt enormous. Ara's heart hammered against her ribs. She could see the door from here, solid and closed, and she wondered if Taryn was standing on the other side, if he'd heard the truck, if he was already bracing himself for whatever came next. "He doesn't know you're coming," Veyron said quietly. She looked at him sharply. "You didn't tell him? I didn't want to give him hope if I couldn't bring you back." His gaze was steady on hers. "He's been hurt enough." Ara's throat tightened. She nodded, unable to speak, and reached for the door handle. Veyron caught her wrist, his grip gentle but firm. "He's angry," he said. "And he's scared. Let him feel it. Don't try to fix it too fast." She met his eyes and saw the warning there, the care. "I won't." He released her, and she stepped out into the clearing. The air was cooler here, shaded by the canopy overhead. She could smell pine and damp earth and the faint trace of wood smoke. It reminded her of the night she'd spent by the fire in Veyron's hall, Taryn curled up beside her with a book in his lap, his small hand resting on her knee like an anchor. The memory made her chest ache. Veyron moved past her and pushed open the door without knocking. He stepped inside, and Ara followed, her pulse loud in her ears. The interior was dim and warm. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting soft light across the wooden floor. There was a table near the window, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot pushed against the far wall. And standing in the center of the room, his arms crossed tight over his chest, was Taryn. He'd grown. That was the first thing she noticed. He was taller now, lean and wiry, with his father's dark hair and the same amber eyes that seemed to see straight through her. He wore a faded shirt and jeans, and his feet were bare against the floor. He looked at her, and his expression didn't change. Ara's breath caught. She'd expected tears, maybe, or questions. But what she saw in his face was something colder, something harder. "Taryn," she said softly. He didn't answer. Veyron moved to the side, leaning against the wall with his arms folded. He said nothing, but his gaze was sharp, watching both of them. Ara took a step forward. You left?" Taryn's voice was flat. "You left the night of the bonding and you didn't say goodbye." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "I looked for you," he said. "I went into the forest the next morning because I thought maybe you'd just gone for a walk. I thought maybe you were coming back." Ara's eyes burned. "Taryn, I'm so sorry. I waited by the road for 3 days." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "Dad told me to come inside, but I didn't listen. I thought if I stayed there long enough, you'd come back, that you'd see me and remember you'd promised." "I remember," her voice broke. "I remember everything." "Then why didn't you stay?" The question hung in the air between them, raw and aching. Ara took another step forward, her hands shaking. "I thought I was protecting your father. I thought if I left, he'd be able to choose someone the pack would accept. Someone who wouldn't make things harder for him." Taryn's jaw tightened. "So you just decided for all of us?" "Yes." She didn't look away. "I made the wrong choice. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. And I hurt you. I hurt both of you." He stared at her, his eyes bright with something that looked like anger and grief all tangled together. "I thought it was my fault." Ara's chest broke open. "No, Taryn, no." "I thought you left because I wasn't enough." His voice cracked. "Because you didn't really want to be my mom. You just said it to be nice." She crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to her knees in front of him, her hands reaching for his but stopping just short, afraid he'd pull away. "That's not true. That was never true." Taryn looked down at her, his face tight with the effort of holding himself together. "Then why didn't you come back?" "Because I was afraid," she said. "I was afraid your father would realize his advisors were right, that I wasn't strong enough or good enough, and I didn't want to watch that happen. I didn't want to be there the day he looked at me and wished he'd chosen someone else." Taryn's breath hitched. "He never wished that." "I know that now." She lifted her hands slowly, palms up, offering. "But I didn't know it then, and I made a terrible mistake. One I can't take back." He stared at her hands, and for a long moment he didn't move. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, he said, "I missed you." Ara's vision blurred. "I missed you too." "Every single day." Taryn's shoulders sagged, and the anger in his face crumbled into something softer. Something younger. He reached out and took her hands, his grip tight and trembling. "I thought you didn't want me," he whispered. "I wanted you," Ara said, her voice breaking. "I wanted you so much. I just didn't know how to stay." He pulled her forward, and she wrapped her arms around him, holding him close while he shook against her. His face pressed into her shoulder, and she felt the dampness of tears soaking through her shirt. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." He didn't answer, but his arms tightened around her, and she knew he heard. Veyron moved closer, his footsteps quiet on the floor. He crouched beside them and rested one hand on Taryn's back, his gaze meeting Ara's over the boy's head. There was no accusation in his eyes, only relief, and something that looked like hope. Taryn pulled back after a long moment, scrubbing at his face with the back of his hand. His eyes were red, but the hardness was gone. He looked at her, and then at his father, and then back at her again. "Are you staying this time?" he asked. Ara looked at Veyron. His expression was steady, waiting, not demanding, just hoping. She took a breath and nodded. "I'm staying." Taryn's face broke into something that wasn't quite a smile but close. He reached for her hand again and held it tight, like he was afraid she'd vanish if he let go. And Ara realized, with a clarity that made her chest ache, that this was what she'd been running from. Not the pack, not the politics, but this. The terrifying, overwhelming truth that she was needed, that she mattered, that walking away hadn't protected anyone. It had only broken the people who loved her. She looked at Veyron, and he nodded once, his hands still resting on Taryn's back. "We go home tomorrow," he said quietly. "Together." Ara squeezed Taryn's hand and felt the bond hum warm and certain between them all. "Together," she agreed. They left the meeting house as the afternoon light began to soften. the three of them walking single file down the narrow path that led back to the truck. Taran walked between them, his hand still wrapped around Ara's, his steps quiet on the packed earth. No one spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with everything still waiting to be said. Veyron drove them north, away from the human town and into the deeper forests where the roads turned to gravel and then to dirt. Ara watched the landscape change through the window, her heart beating faster with every mile. She recognized the shape of the ridgeline in the distance, the way the pines grew taller and closer together, the scent of the air, sharper and cleaner than anything she'd breathed in 3 years. They were going home. The word felt strange in her mind. She'd told herself for so long that home was whatever place she could disappear into. But now, with Taran's weight warm against her side and Veyron's presence steady in the driver's seat, she understood that home had never been a place at all. The pack house appeared through the trees just as the sun touched the horizon. It was larger than she remembered, built from stone and timber, with smoke rising from multiple chimneys. Lights glowed in the windows, soft and golden, and she could see figures moving inside. Her stomach twisted. Veyron parked the truck near the main entrance and cut the engine. He sat for a moment, his hands still on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the house. "They don't know you're here," he said quietly. "Some of them won't be happy to see you." Ara nodded. She'd expected that. "But some of them never stopped looking," he continued. "And they deserve to know you're safe." Taran shifted beside her, his hand tightening around hers. "I'll stay with you," he said. She looked down at him and felt her throat close. "Thank you." Veyron opened his door and stepped out, and Ara followed, her legs unsteady beneath her. The air was cool and familiar, filled with the scent of wood smoke and pine, and the faint musk of wolf that clung to everything in this place. She could hear voices inside the house, low and indistinct, and the sound of footsteps on wooden floors. Taran took her hand again as they climbed the steps to the wide front door. Veyron pushed it open without hesitation and stepped inside, his presence filling the entryway like a command. The hall beyond was warm and bright, lined with wooden beams and lit by oil lamps that cast flickering shadows on the walls. A fire burned in the great hearth at the far end, and around it sat a dozen people, some in chairs, some on the floor, all of them turning at the sound of the door. The room went silent. Ara stood in the doorway, her hand clutching Taran's, and felt every pair of eyes land on her at once. She recognized some of the faces. Alara, Veyron's cousin, her expression unreadable. Marcus, one of the senior hunters, his arms folded tight across his chest. And others she didn't know, younger pack members who must have joined after she left. No one spoke. Veyron stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the room. "I've brought her back," he said simply. Alara stood slowly, her eyes narrowed. "You found her." "I did." "And you brought her here." Her voice was carefully controlled. "After 3 years?" "Yes." Alara's gaze shifted to Ara, sharp and assessing. "Why did you leave?" Ara's mouth went dry. She'd known this question would come, but hearing it spoken aloud made her chest tighten. She forced herself to meet Alara's eyes. "I overheard the advisors after the bonding ceremony. They said a human-born mate would weaken Veyron's claim. I thought if I left, he'd be able to choose someone stronger." Alara's expression didn't soften. "So you made that choice for him?" "Yes." Ara didn't look away. "I was wrong." "You were a coward." The word hit like a slap. Ara flinched, but she didn't argue. Because it was true. She had been afraid, and she had run, and no amount of good intention could change that. Veyron's voice cut through the silence, low and dangerous. "That's enough." Alara turned to him, her chin lifting. Is it? She broke the bond and walked away without a word. Taryn stopped eating. You stopped leading. Half the pack wanted to tear itself apart, searching for her, while the other half said good riddance. And now you bring her back and expect us to welcome her with open arms? I expect you to remember your place, Veyron said, his tone colder now. And to show respect to your alpha's mate. She's not your mate if she doesn't want to be here. She's here now. His gaze swept the room, daring anyone to challenge him. And she stays. Marcus stood, his expression hard. The council won't accept this, Veyron. You know that. They've been waiting 3 years for you to choose someone else. Someone who can strengthen your position, not weaken it. Veyron's jaw tightened. The council can voice their concerns at the next session. And then what? Marcus took a step forward. You think standing beside her in front of the pack will make them forget she abandoned you? That they'll just forgive and move on? I'm not asking for forgiveness, Era said, her voice stronger than she felt. I'm asking for a chance to make things right. Marcus's gaze shifted to her, cold and unyielding. You had a chance. You walked away from it. I know. She took a breath, forcing herself to stand straighter. And I can't take that back. But I can be here now. I can face the people I hurt and let them decide if I'm worth keeping. Alara crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. And if they decide you're not? Ara looked at Veyron and then at Taryn, who was still gripping her hand like a lifeline. Then I'll accept that. But I won't run again. The room fell silent again, the tension thick enough to choke on. Veyron moved to Era's side, his hand settling on the small of her back. The touch was firm and possessive, a clear signal to everyone watching. There will be a council session tomorrow night, he said. Anyone who has something to say can say it then. Until that time, Ara is under my protection. She stays in my home, and no one touches her. Is that understood? No one answered, but the message was clear. Alara shook her head slowly, her expression caught between anger and something that might have been pity. You're risking everything for her, she said quietly. Again. I know, Veyron said, and I'd do it 100 times over. He turned and guided Ara toward the stairs at the far end of the hall, Taryn following close behind. The pack watched them go in silence, and Ara felt the weight of their judgment pressing against her back with every step, but she didn't look back. Veyron led her up the stairs and down a long corridor to a door at the end. He pushed it open and stepped inside, pulling her with him. The room beyond was his. She recognized it immediately. The wide bed, the stone hearth, the window that looked out over the forest. It was exactly as she remembered, and the sight of it made her chest ache with longing and regret all tangled together. Taryn slipped inside behind them and closed the door softly. Veyron turned to her, his expression weary. That was the easy part, he said. Ara let out a shaky breath. I know. He moved to the hearth and crouched to build up the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. Taryn sat on the edge of the bed, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze distant. Ara stood in the center of the room, feeling unmoored. What happens tomorrow? You stand before the council, Veyron said without looking up, and you tell them why you're here. And if they reject me? He paused, his hand resting on the mantel. Then he turned to face her, his eyes steady and fierce. Then I reject the council. Ara stared at him. You can't do that. I can. He straightened, crossing the room to stand in front of her. And I will. If it comes to that, you'll lose everything. I have already lost everything that matters once. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin. I won't do it again. Taryn looked up, his voice quiet. Neither will I. Ara's vision blurred. She looked between them, these two people who had every reason to turn her away and were choosing not to, and felt something inside her break open and mend all at once. "I won't let you lose anything because of me," she said. "Not this time." Veyron's expression softened. "Then we face the council together, and we show them that you're exactly where you're meant to be." The council chamber was smaller than Ara remembered, or maybe she'd just grown used to empty rooms where no one watched her. Stone walls rose on three sides, carved with symbols older than memory, and a single hearth burned at the far end. Benches lined the space in a half-circle, already filled with pack members whose faces ranged from curious to hostile. Veyron had left her at the door with Taryn at her side and walked to the center alone. He stood now beneath the smoke hole in the ceiling, his shoulders straight, his hands loose at his sides. He looked every inch the alpha, and Ara felt her chest tighten with the weight of what she was about to ask him to give up. The council elder, a woman named Sienna with silver hair and eyes like flint, rose from her seat at the front. "You called this session, Veyron. Speak your purpose." "I've brought my mate before you," Veyron said, his voice carrying easily through the chamber. "She's come to address the fracture her absence caused." Murmurs rippled through the room. Ara felt them like needles against her skin. Sienna's gaze shifted to her. "Then let her speak." Veyron turned and nodded once. Not a command. An invitation. Ara took a breath and stepped forward, Taryn moving with her, until Veyron shook his head gently, and the boy stopped at the edge of the circle. She walked alone across the stone floor, feeling every eye follow her, until she stood beside Veyron in the center. The bond hummed between them, steady and warm, and she drew strength from it. 3 years ago, I left the night of our bonding," she said, her voice quieter than she'd meant it to be. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I left because I heard the advisors say that a human-born mate would weaken Veyron's claim. I thought if I disappeared, he could choose someone the pack would accept, someone who wouldn't make him vulnerable." Sienna's expression didn't change. "And now you've returned. Why?" Ara's hands trembled, and she folded them together to hide it. "Because I was wrong. I thought I was protecting him, but I only caused more harm. I hurt him. I hurt Taryn. I fractured the pack." She paused, forcing herself to meet the elder's eyes. "I can't undo what I did, but I can release him from the bond so he can move forward without me holding him back." The silence that followed felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. Sienna tilted her head, studying her. "You would sever the bond, yes, and you believe that would restore his authority." "I believe it would give him the freedom to choose what's best for the pack," Ara said, "without the liability I represent." Veyron went still beside her. She could feel the tension radiating from him, but he didn't speak. Sienna's gaze shifted between them, sharp and assessing. "And you agree to this, Veyron?" "No." His voice was flat and absolute. Ara turned to him, her heart lurching. "Veyron." "No," he said again, louder this time. He faced the council, his jaw set. "I didn't bring her here to sever the bond. I brought her here so you could see that she's returned, that she's chosen to stay." Marcus stood from his seat, his expression hard. "She left once. What's to stop her from leaving again when the pressure gets too heavy?" "I won't," Ara started, but Veyron's hand found hers and squeezed once, firm and grounding. "She won't," he said, his gaze locked on Marcus. "Because this time she knows what it costs, and she's not running." Alara rose next, her arms crossed. "The pack doesn't trust her, Veyron. You can't change that with words." "Then let her earn it back." His hand tightened around Ara's. "The same way any of you would if you'd made a mistake." "This wasn't a mistake." Someone called from the back. "She abandoned her alpha. That's betrayal." Ara flinched, but Veyron stepped forward, his voice cutting through the rising murmurs. She left because she thought she was protecting me. That's not betrayal. That's love twisted by fear. He turned to face the room, his presence filling the space. And I won't stand here and let you condemn her for it when half of you are ready to tear this pack apart searching for her. The room went quiet again. Veyron's gaze swept across the benches, his expression fierce. 3 years ago, I stood before you and chose Ara as my mate. I spoke the vows. I accepted the bond. And nothing that's happened since has changed that choice. The advisors, Marcus began. The advisors were wrong, Veyron interrupted. And anyone who thinks a human-born mate makes me weak is welcome to challenge me and find out. The threat hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. No one moved. Ara's breath caught. She looked at Veyron and saw the determination in his face, the unwavering certainty, and realized with a jolt that he wasn't asking for permission. He was telling them. Sienna stood slowly, her expression unreadable. You would divide the pack over this. I would unite it, Veyron said, by showing you that strength isn't about bloodlines or tradition. It's about loyalty, trust, and the courage to stand beside the people you love even when it's hard. He turned to Ara, his hands still wrapped around hers, and his voice softened. I'm not letting you sever the bond. Not now. Not ever. Ara's vision blurred. You'll lose your position. Then I'll lose it. He lifted her hand to his chest, pressing it over his heart. But I won't lose you again. Her throat closed, and she couldn't speak. Couldn't do anything but stand there while the bond blazed bright and certain between them. Veyron turned back to the council, his voice steady and clear. Ara's my mate. She stands under my protection, and anyone who wants to challenge that can do so now. The silence stretched long and tense. Marcus sat down slowly, his jaw tight. Ilara shook her head but said nothing. One by one, the others settled back onto the benches, their expressions ranging from reluctant acceptance to open disapproval. But no one challenged him. Sienna regarded them both for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she nodded once, a small dip of her chin. The bond stands, she said. But know this, Veyron, the pack will watch her, and if she runs again, there will be no second return. She won't run, Veyron said. Ara found her voice at last, small but steady. I won't run. Sienna's gaze held hers for a beat longer. Then she sat down, her hands folded in her lap. Then this session is closed. The Alpha has made his choice. The council began to rise, the murmur of voices filling the chamber as people filed toward the door. Some glanced at Ara as they passed, their expressions cold. Others looked at Veyron with something that might have been respect, or might have been pity. Terran pushed through the crowd and reached them, his face tight with worry. Are you okay? Ara pulled him close with her free hand, her voice breaking. I'm okay. Veyron guided them both toward the side door, away from the crowd, and out into the cool evening air. The forest stretched out before them, dark and quiet, and Ara felt the weight of the chamber lift from her shoulders, but the bond still pulled tight between them, and when she looked up at Veyron, she saw the exhaustion in his face, the cost of what he'd just done. You shouldn't have risked that, she said quietly. He stopped and turned to her, his hand cupping her face. I told you once, you're worth the risk. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, and felt Terran's hand slip into hers. We should go inside, Veyron said after a moment. Before someone decides they're not done talking. Ara nodded, and together the three of them walked back toward the house, the firelight glowing warm through the windows, and for the first time in 3 years, she let herself believe she was finally home. They climbed the stairs in silence, the three of them moving through the quiet house while the murmur of voices faded below. Ara's legs felt unsteady, her pulse still racing from the council session, from Veyron's words, from the weight of everything that had just been decided without her permission, but entirely for her sake. Veyron pushed open the door to his chamber and held it, while Taryn slipped inside first. Ara followed, her hand brushing Veyron's as she passed, and the bond hummed warm between them. The fire had burned low while they were gone, and Veyron moved to build it back up, his movements calm and deliberate. Taryn sat on the floor near the hearth, his arms wrapped around his knees, watching the flames catch and grow. Ara stood near the window, looking out at the forest beyond. The trees were dark shapes against the sky, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the faint call of an owl. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. Veyron straightened, brushing ash from his hands. "Yes, I did. You risked your position, your authority, everything you've built." He crossed the room to stand beside her, his reflection joining hers in the glass. "I built it all without you, and it wasn't enough." She turned to face him, her chest tight. "What if they're right? What if I make you weaker?" "You don't." His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "You make me remember why I wanted to lead in the first place. You make me better." Ara's throat closed. She wanted to believe him. Wanted to let go of the fear that had driven her away 3 years ago and trust that maybe, just maybe, she was allowed to stay. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to be what you need. You already are." His forehead rested against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "You've always been." Taryn shifted by the fire, drawing their attention. He looked up at them, his expression uncertain. "Are you going to say the vows again?" Veyron glanced at Ara, his eyes searching hers. "Do you want to?" She thought about the night 3 years ago, standing in the great hall with flowers woven through her hair and her hands trembling as she spoke words she'd memorized but hadn't fully understood. She'd felt the bond lock into place, fierce and undeniable, and then she'd walked away from it because she'd been too afraid to believe it was real. But now, standing here with Veyron's hand warm against her face and Taryn watching them both with hope in his eyes, she understood what those words had meant. Not a binding. A choice. "Yes," she said, "I want to." Veyron's expression softened. He took her hands in his grip steady and sure, and turned her to face him fully. There was no ceremony this time, no council watching, no advisors whispering in the halls. Just the 3 of them in the quiet room, with the firelight casting shadows on the walls and the bond humming between them like a song only they could hear. Veyron spoke first, his voice low and certain. "I choose you, Ara, not because tradition demands it, not because the pack expects it, but because you're the one I want beside me, today, tomorrow, every day after." Ara's vision blurred, but she blinked the tears back and held his gaze. "I choose you, Veyron, not because I'm afraid of being alone, not because I think I owe you, but because you're the one who makes me braver than I am, and because I don't want to run anymore." His hands tightened around hers. "I vow to protect you, to stand beside you when the pack doubts, to remind you every day that you're enough." "I vow to stay," Ara said, her voice breaking. "To trust you when I'm afraid. To be here for Taryn and for you, no matter how hard it gets." The bond flared, bright and warm, and Ara felt it settle deep in her chest, stronger than it had been before. Not a chain. A tether. Something she could hold on to when the fear came back. Veyron pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, and she buried her face in his shoulder and let herself cry, not from sadness, from relief, from the overwhelming certainty that she was finally, truly home. Taryn stood and crossed to them, his hand reaching for Ara's. She pulled back from Veyron just enough to look down at the boy, her heart aching with how much older he seemed than the child she'd left behind. "Can I stay?" Taryn asked quietly. "Just for a while?" Ara nodded, her voice too thick to speak, and guided him to sit beside her on the edge of the bed. Veyron settled into the chair near the fire, his gaze resting on them both with something that looked like contentment. They sat in silence for a long while, the fire crackling softly, the night pressing close around them. Ara felt the exhaustion of the day settle into her bones, but she didn't want to move, didn't want to break the fragile peace they'd found. Taryn leaned against her shoulder, his eyes half closed. "I'm glad you came back," he murmured. "So am I," Ara whispered. Veyron rose from the chair and moved to sit on her other side, his hand resting on her knee. "There's still going to be resistance," he said quietly. "The council accepted it tonight, but not everyone will." "I know," Ara looked at him, her hand covering his. "But I'm not running, no matter what they say." "Good," his fingers laced with hers. "Because I meant what I said down there. You're under my protection, and I don't give that lightly." She smiled, small but real. "I noticed." Taryn shifted, his voice drowsy. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything," Ara said. "When you left, did you think about me at all?" Ara's chest tightened. She turned to look at him, brushing his hair back from his face. "Every single day. I thought about the way you used to collect stones by the river, and the stories you'd ask me to tell before bed, and the way you'd hold my hand when we walked through the market." Taryn's eyes opened, bright in the firelight. "Then why didn't you come back sooner?" "Because I was scared," she said honestly. "I was scared you'd be angry, or that you wouldn't want me anymore. And the longer I stayed away, the harder it was to imagine coming back." He nodded slowly, processing that. "I was angry," he admitted, "but I'm not anymore." Ara pulled him close, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "Thank you." Veyron's hand squeezed hers, and when she looked up at him, she saw the warmth in his eyes, the quiet pride. "You should rest," he said. "Both of you." Taryn yawned, but he didn't move. "Can I stay here tonight? Just tonight?" Veyron glanced at Ara, and she nodded. "Of course you can." Taryn curled up against the pillows, his eyes already closing, and Ara pulled the blanket over him gently. She stood and moved to the fire, wrapping her arms around herself. Veyron joined her, his presence warm at her back. "You did well tonight," he said quietly. "I almost tore your pack apart. You held it together." His hands settled on her shoulders, grounding. "By coming back, by facing them. That took more courage than running ever did." She turned to face him, her hands resting on his chest. "I don't want to disappoint you." "You won't." His voice was certain. "And even if you stumble, I'll be here to catch you." Ara looked up at him, and for the first time in 3 years, she let herself believe that maybe she didn't have to carry everything alone. That maybe, just maybe, she was allowed to lean on someone else. "I love you," she whispered. Veyron's expression softened, and he leaned down to kiss her, slow and gentle. "I love you too." Behind them, Taryn's breathing evened out into sleep, and the fire crackled low and warm. Ara rested her forehead against Veyron's chest and felt the bond hum between them, steady and unbreakable. A soft knock sounded at the door. Ara stiffened, but Veyron's hand on her back kept her steady. He crossed to the door and opened it just enough to see who stood on the other side. Taryn stirred, his voice sleepy. "Who is it?" Veyron glanced back at them, then stepped aside. "Someone who wants to say hello?" Ara's breath caught as Taryn sat up, rubbing his eyes. The door opened wider, and she saw the silhouette of a young woman in the hallway, her expression cautious but warm. It was one of the younger pack members, someone Ara didn't recognize. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the woman said quietly, "but I wanted to say, I'm glad you're back. My mother used to talk about you. She said you were kind." Ara's throat tightened. "Thank you." The woman nodded once, then disappeared back down the hall. Veyron closed the door and turned to Ara, his eyes steady. "It's going to take time, but they'll come around." Ara nodded, her hand reaching for his. "I know." Taryn lay back down, a small smile on his face. She was nice. She was. Ara agreed. Veyron moved to the chair by the fire and settled into it, his gaze resting on them both. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's a new day." Ara lay down beside Taryn, pulling the blanket over them both, and felt the exhaustion finally pull her under. But before she closed her eyes, she looked across the room at Veyron and saw him watching her with something that looked like peace. She was home. And this time, she wasn't leaving.